All right. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you're joining us from, and welcome to another edition of Spring Office Hours. I'm your host, Dan Vega, and we have a special guest with us today, Daniel Garnier. Thank you for joining us, Daniel. How are you doing, my friend?
Good, good. What about you?
I'm good. We were talking before the show, Thanksgiving's coming up next week, and I'm always looking forward to that because it's all about food and family. So can't go wrong there. Um, for everyone who's out there, who there's probably at least one person who doesn't know you, I feel sorry for them. Can you just give us a little bit of an introduction to who you are and what we're going to be talking about today?
Sure. So I'm Daniel. I am based in Paris, France, a lovely city of lights, even though it's not very colorful outside this season. I work for VMware in the Tanzu Spring group. So I am part-time contributing to open source to Spring projects, mostly Spring Security. And the second half of my time is devoted to the Tanzu application platform, and I work on SSO for apps. So taking that Spring goodness, Spring Security goodness that we're working on, and packaging it as a product for users of the Tanzu application platform.
Awesome. And so we're going to talk more about it as we get into it. But I watched a workshop that you delivered for DevOps Belgium, and I learned something new about you. You're also a teacher. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, yeah. So in my spare time, because between all these projects, we have lots of spare time.
Yeah.
I take some time off and I go and teach computer science 102, I guess, is the equivalent for France, or of software engineering 101 at
Yep.
a engineering school, generalist engineering school. So we get third year engineering students, and they take this mandatory class because today who can really escape software? And so we try and get them through the basic concepts of programming, of actually doing the things, not just talking about them.
Yeah.
But we're not doing that using Spring or Java. We're with the basics. We're using Python, and then
Nice.
we try and give them a little bit of web experience, which is
Right.
always fun, right? The
Right.
people like their first interactive, oh, pixels on screen type of
Right.
experience.
It makes it very tangible when you can see that.
Right, much more than the characters that you would have in the terminal, right? Lots
Right. Right.
of courses start with like, oh, print this table of
Right.
Celsius to Fahrenheit conversion.
Right.
What we do is we start with a implement this snake game, right? Eating the fruit.
Oh, nice. Yeah.
Even though the students are now young enough that not all of them know what the snake game is.
That's true. Yeah. Yeah, I wonder, so I'm dating myself here, but when I was in school, this was 20 some years ago, and the web wasn't what it is today. So I very much had a deer in the headlights, like, what am I doing here? What is this thing that I'm trying to learn? Do students still have that? Or are they a little bit more kind of caught up with, because of what, they've grown up with the web?
No, not really. Well, and so we still have this maybe uh, university approach of starting with Python basics. You're doing
Yeah.
lists, and then we throw them into HTML, which is fine-ish, right?
Yeah.
You can see fast feedback, and I
Yeah.
think the real step function is when they get into JavaScript. It's a lot of puzzled reactions. What is happening?
Yep.
This is so different from the very imperative model that they've known with these all
Right.
these callbacks and everything. And so this is where they actually get more surprised and sometimes a bit flustered at learning this. But it's
Yep.
fine. Not all of them will be doing JavaScript for a living, and I
Right.
guess it's okay if you don't know the specifics of one language, as long as you've
Right.
made a project in something, right? You've crafted something with your hands and your keyboard, then I'm happy with that.
Yeah. Do you often find do you often find yourself trying to calm people down and go, listen, I had no idea how to do this stuff either. Like, I have to just you have to have some faith in me that at some point this is gonna click and it's gonna get easier and it's gonna be fun. Right
Yes.
now, it's probably just a lot being thrown at you.
Yeah. Well, they're pretty sharp. They're pretty sharp. But there's always one or two that they want to learn, but they have a
Yeah,
hard time internalizing all of this,
yeah,
and so yes, you have to be very reassuring with those. Most of the other students, it's more a question of, but have you ever, like, have you thought about it yourself? Like, you're asking me this question. If I
right.
were to ask you, could you design an experiment to find this out? And then they're usually pretty capable of doing that.
That's great. Yep. Cool. Well, we are going to be talking about spring security today. Today's episode is kind of all about spring security. Like I said, we are going to give everyone the link here in a little bit, but I watched a workshop that you did. What was this? Almost 2.5, 3 hours at
Yeah.
DevOps.
It's a
That's
three
crazy.
hour with a break. So it's a for people watching it on the YouTubes, that would be 2.5 hours.
Nice.
For the speaker, it's 3 hours because the break in the middle, just
Yeah.
answering questions.
Right. Right. And this was on spring security demystified.
Yes.
And you know, not funny, but funny to find out that 2.5, 3 hours later, you've really just kind of introduced people to spring security. It's such a large, complex topic. We were talking about this a little bit before the show, and it's just like people come up to me and say, "Hey, I want to learn Spring Boot. Like, where do I start?" That's a really loaded question. Like, you need to have like an objective, some intention on why you're going to learn it. I think the same comes with spring security. You have to have a reason. Like, what are you trying to do with spring security? And that's really kind of a great place to start. So
Yeah.
we'll get into this. We have some comments coming in. I just want to say good morning from Canada. Good morning
Good
to you.
morning.
All right. Good morning from India. Love to see it. Hello. How's everything hangs together is very overwhelming when you first start programming. I'm 26, but when I first started learning, it was overwhelming. Yeah, I mean, it's funny you say that. Again, I'm dating myself, but this is 20 years, and I feel like just recently things have like clicked for me. So, I think one of the things that when it comes to being a programmer, everybody in the room probably already knows this, but it is you are taking on a lifelong learning journey that never ends, and that's something you need to be okay with. So I think that in general, programmers are lifelong learners. They love to learn, and that's kind of why we stick around.
Yeah, I learned from a book. I remember now when I was 16, when I first picked up that huge, like, the huge book of PHP and MySQL, and I went
Yeah,
through all of it, typing the examples in my
yeah,
non, like, just standard Windows notepad, and
yeah.
like seeing the results on the screen. That was pretty amazing.
I think I still have them back here somewhere on my bookshelf, but the big JavaScript book that was like
Right.
this thick, and then JavaScript the good parts, which was like this thick. All right. Like, how do these files and things? Yep. Good morning from Ukraine. Good morning
Good
to you.
morning.
Recently, I've implemented Spring Security. Thanks, Dan and Daniel. Watch the DevOps Belgium workshop for your suggestions and input with Spring Authorization Server. Funny you should bring that up. Prepping for this show, Daniel and I talked a little bit about Spring Authorization Server, so we may get into some examples of that today. Good morning from Germany.
Hello.
Good morning from, I don't even know how to pronounce that. Do you know what that is?
Yes, well, I would know it in French, Eritrea, right?
There you go. I'm glad you said that. That sounds
Good
way better when
afternoon.
you say it. Bonjour from France.
Salut.
Hello from the UK. Man, we got everybody here today. Hello from
Hey, like the
France.
French crowd.
Yes, they are here for you. Hi from Kosovo. I believe that the book Spring Security 2020 is the best resource. I'm not sure which book that is. Spring Security 2020. I'd have to look that up. I know another book that I'm a big fan of is Spring Security in Action from our friend of the show, Lars. He has a great YouTube channel as well, so I'll try and get that in the show notes. Again, we are Germany, Bangalore, India. Ooh, All right, Africa.
Eritrea. Yeah.
It's midnight in Japan. Well, that is some dedication. We thank
Right.
you for showing up. I would be sleeping or I'd be up because I have a 2-year-old. So
Right.
sometimes I'm up at 2-year-old. Hello from Nigeria. Thanks for joining us. Hello from Boston. Wow, we have quite the crowd today, Daniel. I think it's all for you. So
They're all for secure. They're all here for security.
I'm just trying to get everybody in here. Hello from Morocco. Good afternoon from Brazil. Good morning from India. I have a Canadian in Utah. Hello from Romania. And hello from India. Hey, from Nepal. I'm learning Spring XML annotation stuff. Can you overlay how I should approach learning Spring in Spring Boot? Again, this is something that has come up a lot on this show. I think, I briefly mentioned it before. I think going into something, you have to have a really good, you have to have a reason behind learning something, right? If you just want to say, I'm going to learn Spring, that's a very large subject to tackle. I think if you get more selective with your intentions behind it, it becomes a little bit easier. So, again, we were talking before the show. If you rephrase that and you said, I want to learn Spring Boot because I want to deploy a REST API. So now you've kind of narrowed this down. You have a very you have a narrow intention of what you want to do, and you'll go into it just learning that one thing. But then you'll start to learn other things in Spring that you may not have set out to learn. So as you're building a REST API, you may need to connect to a database. You may need to understand concepts like dependency injection or logging, things that come with building these types of applications. But if you just go in and have a list of things that you need to learn, it's a lot harder to do it that way. So I would say just be specific with what you're trying to do. If you go to spring.io and you go to the guides have a very narrow focus. I want to build a REST API using Spring Boot. So start there. That allows you to build that thing that you're trying to build. And then from there, you can use the documentation. You can go to YouTube. There's a couple of good YouTube channels out there. Also, there's a awesome Spring repository on GitHub. I've linked to that before. That has a list of books and YouTube channels and guides and workshops. So check that out. So that'd be my suggestion.
When you're done with your first project and you've taken note of these things that you've touched, right? Oh, dependency injection, you're learning some of it, but you want to go further, then it's a good time to go into the reference documentation.
Exactly.
They often have this architecture page, and so reading it after having used it is usually very useful, because you kind of understand, oh, these concepts, this is what I played with, and then it opens to new things you could do, and then you can come up with new projects to learn more things.
And that's a perfect explanation, because if you just go into the reference documentation without building anything and try to understand dependency injection, you're a better person than me if you can do that, because you're just going to be overwhelmed. I don't know what this is. But in the context of, like you said, of building something, it becomes more apparent, and now you can take that deep dive. So well said. Hello from Turkey. Hello from Switzerland. Hello from Pakistan. Hello from India. I've been working on this project for my boot camp. Boot camps are very near and dear to my heart. If you don't know, I used to work at a boot camp, so I love that. I was trying to figure out how to implement JDBC tokens. Your videos were
JWT.
I think JWT, with maybe looking up users in JDBC. Your videos were tremendous help on getting started, Dan. Thank you very much. I appreciate that. Hi from Peru.
Hola.
Security is the first matter for a finance app. How can a startup holder convince investors to trust Spring Security and what it offers? I would say Spring Security is tried and tested, been around, since the beginning of Spring. So I don't know that I have a really good answer for that, but I know that, just given the longevity of the project, the number of businesses relying on Spring Security, I would start there. I mean, it's much better than rolling your own. So you're not rolling your own security,
Yeah.
you're using something that's been tried and tested by many, many organizations. So I would say that.
And if you look at how responsible the team is in handling CVEs, disclosing things, publishing
Yep.
patches, you can see how fast to respond to this. This is a
Yep.
good proof that this is actually a maintained library.
Right. Right. Hello from Mexico. Good morning from India. Dan, any good reference videos, channels for Spring Cloud data flow? Not off the top of my head,
Should
but
ask around.
we can ask around and I will find that for you. And for Kafka tutorial videos in depth. I know Josh has done some Kafka tutorials, so you may want to, obviously, anything Spring, check out Josh Long. He's probably done something on Kafka, I believe. He's done something recently with Kafka too. So I would check out Spring Tips, check out the Spring Developer channel on YouTube, and just look for Josh. I'm sure he's done something on that recently.
Oh yeah, and just be sure to play it at half speed. It's the only videos on YouTube you would be watching at half speed.
Yeah. Because usually I'm like a 1.75. Hello from Indonesia. Hello, how are you? All right, so I think we're going to get into so if you're new to the show, we just kind of like to take a trip around what's happening in the world of Spring. So I figured we'd take this chance to kind of talk about what's new in the world of Spring, and then we'll kind of get into some security stuff. So today, as we are recording, it is Tuesday, November 15th. We have a lot going on this week and next week. So I will mention this. We will not have a show next week. Again, I am out next week. I believe Deshaun is as well. Thanksgiving here in the US. So I will be out all of next week. So let's talk about this week and next. If you look at tomorrow, Wednesday the 16th, very big release happening. Spring Framework 6. What a long road this has been. I can remember hearing about this a couple of years ago, especially with some of this AOT stuff. So Spring Framework 6 is getting released tomorrow. So check that out. Along with that, you'll kind of see everything else revolving around that. So you'll see things like Spring Data is getting released. So this is like the official release. This is no longer RCs or anything. As we go into next week, you'll see Spring Security. So we'll have a 5.8. And then we'll have Spring Security 6, which is coming up for, Spring Framework 6 and Spring Boot 3. Again, all of these things happening on Tuesday. So we have authorization server, which we'll talk about. That is going to hit 1.0, which is a huge milestone. I remember this kind of being talked about years ago. And so to see this kind of come to a 1.0 release. Spring for GraphQL, big fan of that if you watch this show. And then next Thursday, Spring Boot 3.0. So the two big releases, Spring Framework 6, Spring Boot 3.0, all happening within the next 2 weeks. And kind of all of the projects in the ecosystem will be kind of aligning with that. So really great to see. What are you excited about with these releases, with Spring Boot 6, Spring Boot 3, or Spring Boot 3 and Spring Framework 6?
I think AOT, right? The native compilation of all Spring Boot related ecosystem is quite amazing. It's going to be a very big change for people doing, lots of services or microservices or functions. So it's going to be very, very nice. And of course, Spring Authorization Server, which is what got me into Spring Security in the first place.
Nice.
Quite a piece of work. I'm glad that it was a 2-year journey. I think we started in 2020.
Wow, that's awesome.
And we've come full circle, right? Because there was an authorization server on Spring Security, and then it got OAuth 2 got rewritten, and then without an authorization server, then the community asked for one. And here we are.
So cool to see 1.0.0 right there. This is exciting. So cool. That's kind of what's happening in the world of Spring. Lots happening. Again, if you're not familiar with it, you can head over to calendar.spring.io. You get this nice calendar view. You can also get a list view. You can also check out, hey, what's happening in December. Not much. People like to take off the
That's
holidays.
yes. Well, probably a patch here or two, right? We're
Yep.
releasing so many majors that
Lots
maybe
happening
this,
in
yeah.
in November, so there may be some patches in December. So that is good. Leaving some room for that. Okay, so I want to talk about kind of the blog. So if you head over to spring.io/blog, you can kind of get up to date with things that are going on in the Spring ecosystem as well. This Week in Spring by Josh, always a good kind of, hey, what's happening? But I did want to take a look at this as we have Spring Boot. Oh, no. As we have Spring Boot 3.0 getting released next week. RC2 was released last week, and amazed to see that there was 116 enhancements between RC1 and RC2. If you check out the release notes, we talked about this last week with Greg Turnquist. He was on the show. One of the big things to note that Jakarta EE has moved from 9 to 10. So officially, we were planning on releasing Jakarta EE 9 with Spring Boot 3. We've since moved that up to 10 because the end of life announcement for Apache Tomcat 10 kind of made us change direction there. So we've upgraded from Jakarta E9 to Jakarta E10. Again, no, I don't think any major API changes happened in 10. I think this is really,
I think
again,
deprecations were enacted.
deprecations, right? So this is really, 8 kind of moved over to Jakarta. 9 was, hey, let's replace all of the namespaces. 10, let's do some deprecations. But I've said this on the show before. I think what I'm really excited about is now we get to see the evolution of these APIs. So we get to start moving forward again, and instead of just kind of standing in the mud, if you will. So yeah, excited about that. Excited to see we're on Jakarta EE10 there, and then you could read through the release notes. But that's Spring Boot 3.0 RC2. And I believe if you go to start.spring.io, yep, it is now an option here to go ahead and select. So you can select that. So I think that's really all I wanted to talk about as far as kind of what's new. Again, I will try and include this video in the show notes for today. This is Spring Security Demystified by our friend Daniel here. This was at Devox Belgium. Again, you can see the running time on this, 2 hours and 35 minutes of Spring Security in action. Definitely worth checking out. And I think we had talked about getting you on this show before I saw that video. But when I saw that video, I'm like, we have to get you on and talk about this. So
Yeah.
let me just see here. I think I have some more. We have some more comments coming in really quick. Hello from Kazakhstan. Hello from Cali,
Oh, Colombia, mi
Colombia.
patria.
Awesome.
My
So,
mom is from Colombia. I'm half Colombian.
oh, nice. You got a big fan base here today. I love it.
Yeah, right?
Okay, so where to start with Spring Security? I think before the show, I think one of the, I was talking to you, I wrote up a abstract for a talk that I want to give next year. And I think, one of the things that really starts to confuse people when they get into Spring Security is when you hear all these terms and you hear these things like OAuth 2 and Open Connect ID and resource server and authorization server and JWT. It's like you're throwing all these things at me again when I haven't learned kind of the basics. So I guess where I want to start with you is how do you get started learning Spring Security?
Oh yeah, that's a great question. I think you pointed to the correct place, right? The guides on the Spring.io website are usually a good place to start with
Yep.
good examples. The Spring Security repository also has samples, and so it has samples for different types of configurations, different protocols. Um, but it starts with a requirement, as you said,
Hmm.
right? You're setting out to do something, uh, and you don't want to be implementing, anything auth2 related if you don't really know that you need that, right?
Right.
You want to go as simple as possible on what you can implement, because you will have to understand multiple things. You will have to understand the security model of your application. What are you trying to secure? The protocols or frameworks you will use. So, for example, auth2 or OpenID, and then you will have to understand how does that fit in your Spring app, right? So the Spring security side of things.
Yep.
Um, so that's a lot to take in, and you know, unless you are a big nerd like me and you want to sit down and read the 60 pages of RFC and try and get a model out of it, um, it's kind of difficult. And I guess I only understood those RFC after using them, right?
Yep.
After trial and error around OAuth and stuff like that. Um, so if you want to get started with securing your application, Spring Security, you should start with this, and the guides. You can start with an in-memory list of hard-coded users and try and understand how does that protect my application? What can I gain from that?
Right.
And then, is that enough to secure my app in production? Do I have a monolith with a JDBC database? They can put my users on that database.
Yep.
Probably, having Spring Security is enough. Maybe Spring Session on top of it. But I don't know. You're mentioning, JSON Web tokens. Maybe you have, instead of just a monolith, you have this backend service, and then you have a front end. So
Right.
how does that work? So go and check Dan's guide for this. And then the more constraints you add, oh, now I don't have one backend, but I have, 3, 4 services that I talk to. And so now I have one more constraint. Where do I put my users? What do we do with this?
Yep.
And so this is where you reevaluate the choice and try and see what's available to you. And this is where you would see, auth come into play.
Yep.
Um,
I,
and for
I
for
think
Spring Security, and for Spring Security, I think a great place to start is the talk that you mentioned. It's a narrated version of the reference doc and the architecture,
right.
and it's a condensed uh, extract of what I learned by contributing to it. There's a
Hmm.
lot to learn in actually understanding how it's built inside, so you can follow how it works, and then you can much more easily, extend and do your own things and go beyond a getting started guide.
Yep. Yep. Yeah, and I think you mentioned something there, kind of getting started with just minimal configuration, like starting small and then expanding based on your needs, right? A lot of the tutorials I do and the tutorials I think that everybody does, we start with just like a simple configuration and we have an in-memory user and we have no password encoder, right? And I often get questions like, well, why wouldn't you talk to a database and use a real password encoder right off the bat? And it's like, we'll get there, but like, I don't want to complicate things as you're starting to like learn these basic concepts first. So let's first just learn how to create an in-memory user and use that user to authenticate. And once you have understood this configuration, now maybe we can talk to a database to get our users. Now we can talk about like, let's not store our passwords in a database with plain text. Let's talk about password encryption. So I believe that you do have to like really start to build on top of these like core concepts. So don't go in thinking you're just going to like throw all this code in there and understand everything.
Yeah.
Start from the basics, the basic configuration if you can.
And this usually doesn't go well when you try it all at once, right?
Right, right, right,
And it's important to maybe touch the different areas that you think you will need, and assess the risk of that, or like how much do I know and how much could I not know,
right,
and try
right,
and put the focus on that, right? Once you have your basic authentication with a page secured, what do I want to learn next? What could be hard?
right, right. I have a question here. Can you guys post the link for the Spring Security presentation? I'm going to do that now. So let's post that in here. This will go out. Dan's guide for separated UI. Where is that? So I don't know that I have a guide on that. I have a guide. I have a YouTube video on how to get started with JSON web tokens. So if you're using a front end that talks to, say, a back end, that's a good approach to doing that using JSON web tokens. And there are a lot of kind of tutorials on the web and videos that kind of use the old way of doing this by creating like your own custom authentication filter, and it's a little bit complicated. And so I reached out to the Spring Security team, and in our Slack channel here, and Daniel kind of chimed in on a lot of that, and I said there's got to be an easier way to do this, and of course there is, using auth2 resource servers. So check that video out. We go from like step one to how to kind of secure that REST API using JSON web tokens. So thanks. Hello from Brazil. Whoops. Let's start with securing a REST API. All right, maybe we could do that. Maybe I can jump in and show a little bit of code. Maybe you can walk me through some of this. Let's see here. So I think I do want to, obviously we only have an hour. At this point, we have a half hour, so we can't go too far into this, but I think what I do want to show is kind of the new approach to this, even though we can point to some videos that your video walks through this. I know my videos do as well, but here we're using Spring Boot 2.7.5. So anything on Spring Boot 2.7 is now using, correct me if I'm wrong, Spring Security 5.7, right?
Yes.
And 5.7 is where we made this change to deprecate the web security configure adapter. Is that correct?
Yes, maybe 5.6. I can't remember.
Okay,
it's
somewhere
deprecated,
around
but it's still here.
It is until 3.0. I learned this the
Yes.
other day when I was messing around with a 3.0 kind of sample, and it is completely gone in 3.0. So we'll talk about that in a second.
If you want to prep for that, there's a great blog post. I think it's called Spring Security without the web security configure adapter, and it talks to you how to migrate away from that.
Yep. Cool. So I have just a normal 2.7.5 Spring Boot. I'm using Java 17. I have Spring Starter Web. And what we can do is we can go ahead and add this dependency here. I think people always get confused. Once you create a project, you could still add dependencies to it. It's actually pretty easy. So we can come in here and say Spring Boot Starter Security, and that will give us kind of the security bits that we need. And if we reload this and everything works, let's go ahead and create a new REST API. Maybe we'll just call this our home controller, and we'll create a REST controller here. And inside of here, we can do a, let's say, public.
Public is reserved.
Yep. We'll just say home. This will be a public one, and then this could be private.
It's still reserved.
Oh man, I'm using all the wrong words here.
Perfect.
So this one could be, this is what I wanted to do, public. And so we can say this is our public and this is our private. So we actually aren't going to do anything with this yet. We'll come back to this, but this is kind of a classic example, right? Like I have a REST controller here. I have some endpoints. I may, this, in a real world application, I'd probably have some separate resources for things that I want to lock down. I'm not usually getting like granular control over saying this one method you can access, but this one you can't. But this is good for an example.
Yeah.
But you could think of it in like an admin controller versus a public controller, right? Like, hey, I have an admin controller where I can create, delete, update different resources, whereas a public controller, I may just have views that list out all of the things or list out one thing. So you can do this at we could do this at a method level. We could do it at a controller level, but this is good for an example. So I have one that's public and one that's private. Where do we get started with this? We need to set up some type of configuration, right?
Right. So what's really interesting with this and what's really cool is that by just adding that starter security, you've added the Spring Security dependencies on the class path of this application.
Right.
And Spring Boot recognizes this. And so if you boot up this application, it's already secured. So like Spring Security and Spring Boot agree that your app should be secured by default. So if you try and access those endpoints, you will get a login page.
All right, so let's try that. Let's say localhost 8080/public. Hey, log in.
Right.
I don't have a login. Well, I do though. So I really like what you said there. It's secure by default. That is a really important concept to understand, and you should take that approach too when building out your configuration. Make sure that everything is secure by default. That is really the best way to go, so that you don't accidentally allow someone to get access to something. So now I have this little user-generated security password. What is this? Why do we do this? Why is this so random?
So this is what Spring Boot does for you. And if you read the line below, it says it's for development use only. So this is for you to get started without having to, it's the batteries inclusive of Spring Boot. There's a user called user, and then you can use this password to log in, and you would log in into this app.
Cool. And there's our endpoint.
Right,
so
public and private.
And I think the reasoning behind generating this kind of UUID password is then if you were to forget about doing this, changing things and just committing this to Git and pushing this out somewhere to the public, somebody's not going to be able to just look up, hey, what's the default password in Spring Boot and get access to your application.
Yes, exactly.
Cool. Right, so I have like a generated user and a generated password. But this is for development. This isn't going to get me far. Maybe we want to do a little bit more configuration, right?
So there are two things we would want to configure. One is this password that we copy from the console every time. It might be a bit, annoying. Maybe we want to get this a look. And then the second dimension we want to work on is that public and private page. One of them should be public. And now, since it's secure by default, everything is private. So we can introduce a new configuration class.
So let's just call this security config.
Right. And so annotated with configuration for Spring configuration or Spring Boot to pick it up as a configuration class.
Actually, we'll come right back to this in a second. I just do want to mention, so you will probably come across tutorials that say, hey, you can web security configure adapter. You'll come across tutorials that may do this. So it extends the web security configure adapter. And as you can see, the line through it here says that it is deprecated for removal. And in fact, in Spring Boot 3 and Spring Framework 6, it is removed. So we want to move to this new kind of component model of securing our configuring our applications. Now you said something. I've done this for a while too. Somebody called me out on it, but I would always come in here and add configuration because this is a configuration class. Somebody called me out and said, hey, if you enable web security, this is actually a configuration class. So it has a configuration annotation. So you actually can do it either way. You can add configuration here. It's not going to hurt. But if you add enable web security, that has a configuration annotation on it. And the other question I get a lot is, do I need the enable web security annotation? And the answer is no, because Spring Boot will actually add it for you. I like to be very explicit with things. It's not a big deal to add one annotation here. So I like to go ahead and add it. If it's going to be added for me anyway, then I'm just going to go ahead and add it. So.
Right. So what should we start with? The password thing or the public-private pages?
I think let's do the password thing first.
Right. So if you went onto that article that I mentioned about moving away from the web security configurer adapter, there's an example here.
Hmm.
Also on the guides, you have to provide a bean of type in memory or user detail service is fine. This is the interface. Yes.
Yep.
And
It's
then
going to be a
for
bean.
our exactly, and for our use case, we're going to use a in-memory user detail service. This is basically the repository in which your application looks for users and the passwords. A details manager, you're correct. And it could be JDBC, it could be Redis and whatever. In-memory is fine, for example. And so we have to bootstrap it with some users.
Yes. All right. So we need to start with a user.
Right.
So we need to create a new in-memory user. So we can say user.
It's user and I think it was upstairs over there. Yes, user details. This
There
one.
we go. So with details. So we're providing some details about this user.
Isn't there a
With
builder directly on that class?
there is user.builder.
That's good enough for what we do, I think. Yeah. And then maybe we need to give it some stuff, right? So a name, a password.
And password. So now we could do, so maybe it's a good time to talk about a password encoder. So it's going to ask us at some point for a password encoder because we don't want to just, what's the requirement there? So I get a lot of questions of like, hey, I don't really want to encode my passwords. Like, you do. You do.
You do want to encode your passwords. I think you can look up. It's been probably 10 years that we have massive database leaks because
Yep.
someone just dumps the database of the company with all the users in them.
Right.
And
Right.
users also have an email, and then suddenly you've divulged both the email and the password that people have reused across
Yep.
websites.
Oh, they use the same one for everything.
Yes, we've been telling them not to do this, but who doesn't, right?
Right. Right.
And so you as a administrator, you don't want to know what the user is typing in. You just want to know that it is correct. And this is
Right.
where you use a password encoder. There are plenty of algorithms to only store a hash of that password, a representation of that password that cannot be used to trace back to the original password that was typed in.
Right. So we have one password encoder that we should not use in production, but we can use for a demo.
The
And that is
famed
the
no op.
no op password. So we can create a password encoder bean, or we can use these little brackets inside of here. And I always get questions like, when you do something like this, or you do something like this, what is that actually doing?
So if you're not providing your own password encoder, Spring Boot will provide one for you. I think it's Boot, and will
Mhm,
provide a default password encoder, or it
mhm.
uses the default password encoder factory. I don't know what the semantics are. And so basically, it will that that password encoder supports multiple schemes of encoding the password, and this little header that we put in here tells the following password should be encoded using the no op version, using bcrypt, using MD5 if you're supporting
R-
insecure
Right.
methods.
Yep.
And so basically
Cool.
this one says store plain text.
Don't do what we're doing here. Again, this is, instead of like throwing all these things on top of a demo, this is kind of the simplest way to get going, to kind of teach this concept. But then as you build this out, you will want to use a real password encoder.
Right.
So we have a username, a password. What else do we need here?
We
We
can
need
give them roles, I think. You have a semicolon already. Yeah. You can say this one, it's Dan, so it must be an admin, right? And then I think that's enough. You can add more things to it, but oh, the type is incorrect. Since you're using
Oops.
Java
Yep.
17, you can cheat and just put var, right?
Yep. I like that. All right. So we have a user. This is the user that we're going to use in the system now. Instead of using user and this long generated password, we can use Dan and password and log in with that. So
Yes.
now I need to return something here with this user.
Yes.
This is
In the constructor,
in-memory
yeah.
user. Cool. So that should satisfy the user stuff, right?
Yes,
So
totally.
let's try and restart this. And if we're paying attention to the output in the console here, we're going to no longer see that generated password, right? So
Yes.
that means that we have overridden that. We have our own user. We shouldn't have to rely on that anymore. So now I can say Dan and password, and boom, we are logged in as Dan. So cool. We've solved one end of that kind of problem that we set out to solve here.
And this is one of the classic, Spring configuration mechanisms, providing beans, overriding what Spring Boot would give you.
Yep.
Is this: you provide a bean, and Spring Security respects this configuration model. So for,
Mm-hmm.
I don't know, for OAuth, and you need a client registration repository, if you don't provide one, Spring Boot builds one for you, but you can build
Mm-hmm.
your own implementation of that and just provide the bean.
Yep. Perfect. And then, as we said earlier, this is kind of the starting point. So now you can add in, if you want to add in a couple different users, you can. They're in-memory users, but maybe you want like somebody with a different role, or maybe you want another user with multiple roles. You can do that here as the starting point. But then we have different ways to get our users, right? Like we can talk to a database. We could talk to a file if we wanted to. So the user details service, that is the interface that we are trying to satisfy this load by username contract, right?
Yeah.
So what are, I mentioned a couple. What is the next step? Like, what do you do? What's kind of the next way to get some users?
So for users, we said JDBC. You have
Mm-hmm.
the database type of implementation of that, which has all the defaults that you need. I think it's called JDBC user details
Manager, yep.
manager. Yeah, there you go. And so you can set that one up with a JDBC template. It puts all the right columns in there. It puts everything you need to add a user, remove a user, turn a user on or off, or expire an account, stuff like that. And
Perfect.
you can build on top of that as well, right? If you need more information about your users that are not managed by this implementation, you can create another implementation of that, or a subclass of that manager, and add the columns you want to track, last time they logged in, for example, or whatever is
Mm-hmm.
not tracked in there.
And then I think I've done a video on this as well. So if that doesn't work and you don't want to conform to like that table and those column names and you have your own setup, you can really kind of write your own service. So I wrote like a JPA user details service, and that was using Spring Data JPA and talking to its own database. And at the end of the day, all you have to do is write something that implements this user details service, and you have this one load by username method that you need to be able to provide. So like when I look up a user, how do I look them up? Here's a repository name, go find me user by the username. And if it returns something, you found a user. If it doesn't, then that is not a valid user. So it's a little bit more complicated than that, but there is a way to kind of roll your own, if you will.
This is a great place to start, right? To, like, you deploy your application, you have your users, but soon, if you're in an enterprise context, you will want to support SSO, you will want to support new things.
Yep.
But I contend that this comes after, right? You
Yep.
set up your development environment first, you make it work with this user details, and then you learn about which protocols are supported in your production environments and how to swap that.
Yep. Yep.
So then we
Okay.
want to secure the private page, right?
Right. So we need a way to say that private method should only be able to be accessed by someone like Dan that has you can do
That
a
is
role of
logged in.
admin or is logged in. Yeah. So we have this thing called the security filter chain. Little tip, if you don't know, if you're using something like IntelliJ, you don't have to write out security filter chain. You can actually just write out SFC and it will kind of provide some hints for you. So security filter chain, I can call it security filter chain. It takes in HTTP security. And at the end of the day, we need to return http.build from this, and this will throw an exception. So this is the kind of boilerplate configuration. And this is where, if you look up examples from the previous one with web security configure adapter, you'll see something similar to this kind of chaining method of defining things in your configuration. This is pretty similar to that, but it also has some nice new features that you can use as well.
And if you do this, then you're telling Spring Boot, I want to handle the security of my endpoints myself. And so now by doing this, you lose the default, everything is secure by default here.
Yep. So if we were to, I don't know that I've ever tried this. Let's just try and do this. So what we're saying now is if we go to try to log in here, let's say, this is probably still going to be.
No, it's still, everything is, well, you have no base
Log
page,
out.
but if you go to
Right.
public, it's public because you've said
Right.
Spring Boot, let me handle the security. And now, well, what have you done for security? You've just said
Nothing.
build. So you've got some defaults from Spring Security, pattern protection, like CSRF attacks and stuff like that. But you've lost the choice that was every page must be secured by default, and you have to reintroduce that yourself.
So we should probably get back to that first, right? Like we want to get back to secure by default. So how can we do that? I'm going to go ahead and look at this and IntelliJ is telling me, hey, this is probably the method that you want. It's the most used method, which is authorize HTTP requests. So I can go ahead and do this.
You want curlies in there.
Oops, what happened to that?
Auth.
Yes. So now the first thing we need to do is say, I want you to go ahead and lock down everything. Do we want to say, hey?
These are interpreted in order. So if you just say lock down everything, everything will be locked down and there's no way to reopen the door after that. Okay. But that's a very good reflex, right? Saying any request, I want them to be denied or I want them to be only authenticated users. And then that comes at the very bottom of your declaration. It's your catch-all. So here you're reintroducing this idea of everything is secure by default. And so there's one page we want that doesn't need to be secured, and it's the public page. So we can use an MVC matcher or an ANT matcher. In Spring Security 6, you will be using request matcher, which will select the correct matcher based on your class path. So MVC matcher, and we say which page is that? Well, it's /public. And so here, this is permit all. We want everyone to be able to see that page.
So again, you mentioned this before, but it's really important to understand that these are top down. So if we were to flip these around and say any request has to be authenticated and then /public is permitted all, what would happen?
Well, then a request would come in, and then each of those matchers would be evaluated in order. And the first one says it's any request. So no matter the request that comes in, I'm going to apply this matcher. And it says, ooh, you must be authenticated. So any request that comes in requires an authenticated user. Whereas in that setup, when you go to public, it says, ooh, I know what to do with public. I permit any request. If it goes to foo, it must be authenticated, even though foo doesn't exist. Spring Security doesn't know that. It just knows that you need an authentication to proceed further and discover that foo doesn't exist.
Right. So cool. This should give us what we want. Let's go ahead and restart this. And if we go back here, so public, we are able to go to public If we go to private, now this is not going to do something because we need to do one more thing. But it didn't let us go there, which is good.
Right, it gives us a 403, but we didn't specify. So here we specified the protection. We said, oh, we want that endpoint to be protected, that endpoint to be public, that endpoint, so on and so forth. But then we don't say how we protect these things. And
Yep.
so we can say which protocol or which modes of login we use. So I see you use HTTP basic often if you want to make
Mhm.
curl requests, but you can use form login as well, which will bring back this login page.
What is this defaults? I always see this and we're always, oops. We get this with defaults. What is with defaults?
Right. So you remember if you used the web security configure adapter before, you
Mhm.
remember that you had this configuration authorized request wouldn't take a Lambda in the past prior to 5.6 or 5.5. It
Mhm.
would say authorized request, close parenthesis, and then a new method that said MVC matcher permit all dot any request dot authenticated dot and, right?
Yep.
The new way of configuring things is with lambdas, as we do with here. And
Yep.
so form login here with defaults, it's a lambda. If you command click on it, you can see the implementation. It's a lambda that takes a customizer and that does nothing with it. So it
Gotcha.
just takes the defaults of whatever form login is.
Perfect. Cool. So now with that, I should be able to restart this and get a form when I go to private. And there we go. We can log in with Dan and password. Cool. So not a lot of code. And we really achieved the the start of what we're doing in our application, right? Like this is really the start. Like I'm building a REST API. I need a user to authenticate against, and I need a way to customize the different routes in my application. And we only had two there, but we allowed everyone to go to public and we locked down the private one. And so you can see with just this little bit in a larger application, this will scale out. You'll use the same approach and just kind of repeat it for which ones. Now you can get into like some crazy stuff and say like, oops. So if I wanted to say like, hey, if you're hitting public, then you need to have a specific role. So you could say like has role, has authority. So you can get a little bit more granular if you wanted to, but this is really a good place to start.
And then you can do, sometimes in guides, you'll see method level security,
Mm-hmm.
like at pre-authorize, at post-authorize. You can decorate your methods with that. Um, I think the recommended way for Spring Security would be to use the central configuration that we're showing, right? Spring Security is really built to protect endpoints, HTTP endpoints.
Mm-hmm.
And so you do this configuration in your security config, and then with a glance, you can see what's your security model rather than having to dig left and
Yep.
right and find out. However, this pre-authorized type of methods can allow you to have some level of defense in depth, right? If you have
Yep.
10,000 classes, then, and you have some services that you want to protect,
Mm-hmm.
then having this can help you and your team of 50 developers also express some
Yep.
granularity, some lockdowns. And so if someone messes up or forgets to add the correct protection in the security config, then this one would trigger and would break the chain.
Yeah, and you know where this has really come in handy is I've been doing a lot of work with GraphQL this year. And so GraphQL is a single endpoint slash GraphQL. So now how do I lock down just specific methods in a controller or in a service? The great thing with GraphQL is that the security context propagates all the way down. So if you're in a service that gets called from a controller, you can use these pre-authorized in there and say like, hey, this particular user needs to be an admin to create a new resource on a GraphQL endpoint. So these definitely come in real handy when it comes to GraphQL. I do want to just kind of mention one other thing. Let's go to GitHub. We're not going to have time to completely walk through this, but there, I have some examples of this. If you want to get into like JSON Web Tokens, JWT, again, it's that same configuration, just kind of building on it. We have a security config here. There's a lot more things going on here. there's this really great thing called the OAuth 2 resource server. And basically, what this does is it gives us JWT out of the box. You no longer have to write your own custom JWT filter and do all of the things. We get this nice Nimbus JWT encoder and decoder as part of that Spring Security package, and we can do this. So I think I started with this at the beginning, but two kind of terms that you're going to hear when you get into security are resource server and authorization server. Is there a simple one-liner, two-liner that kind of tells us what those things are
So
as you're starting to build out security?
I think a good litmus test is you go onto Google Images and you look for auth 2, and then you see the diagrams, and then you understand that it may take a little bit more than 1 or 2 lines. So the images are telling, right? So many arrows everywhere. Everything
Yes.
is just arrows, arrows, arrows. And so it takes a bit of time to explain. Maybe if viewers are interested, we could expand on this another time when Deshaun is away.
Yes, for sure.
Definitely, because if I want to learn about this, I would look for a video for a course that walks me through the different elements that are in there.
Yep.
Because just trying to get it from this visual, it's very complicated, right?
Well,
But
yeah,
basically,
this
yeah,
video
go.
that I went through was 45 minutes.
Yes, exactly, right? But like the idea of OAuth is if I have 5 REST APIs, and they all need users to be authorized on them, I don't want my user to log in 5 times, for example.
Mhm.
Or if I have 6 different clients connecting to the same server that serves resources, so resource
Yep.
server. So for example, I don't know, messages or assignments or whatever.
Yep.
And I have 5 applications that use this, and I want to scale this, and I have 6, 7, and now I want these applications to have their own set of credentials, so that when one has a problem because it's built by 5 different teams and maybe there's a security problem in one of them, I don't want to compromise everything, right? And
Yep.
I don't want to have to rotate credentials for everything. So the idea is that, well, this authorization, identification, or authentication and authorization layer is put in a separate service, and that everyone can refer to. So the apps
Mhm.
and the APIs as well, to
Yep.
say, so the apps, you log in with that and it gives you a token, and the app exchanges the token for the assignments, the to-dos, the cart, whatever. And the API looks at the token, validates it with the authorization server, and says, yeah, it's valid, go on, here's your cart.
Yeah, and although what we did here today was pretty simple, this can get very complex. This is something you would not want to repeat in every single service in your
Right.
application, and that's why we use a central place to do something like authorization. Quick question here: does that scale to a large website with many pages?
Yeah, I think you've mentioned that security model, right? Where you group the kind of APIs or resources, right? You have these class of resources, everything under API, I don't know, admin
Mhm.
requires the role admin, and you don't have to be more granular on this.
Yep.
And everything under public is public, and then everything else is just you need to be logged in.
Yep. So yeah, you can again, you can get pretty kind of loose or granular with those MVC matchers, as Daniel said. So you can do some like wildcard matching there. So yeah, the configuration is allows you to get very specific or very kind of loose with that. Thanks for your knowledge, guys. Appreciate it. Any other questions? I think we wanted to get into some authorization server stuff, but we just had so much fun talking about basics here. um, I guess, one thing that you mentioned in your Spring Security Demystified, and we were talking about it before the show. When I have a problem, a lot of the questions I get are, I followed your tutorial, but that user is not able to log in, or that particular route is not locked down. Do you have advice on like how to figure out what's going wrong there?
Yeah. So I think if you don't want to get too deep into Spring Security in the beginning, right? If you
Right.
don't want to listen for 2.5 hours of me speaking, one thing you can do that's very easy is setting the logging um, to level to trace in Spring
Hmm.
Security. Um, right, you say in your application YAML, you say logging level, and then everything under org Spring Framework Security, you set it to trace.
Hmm.
And Spring Security prides itself on having a good trace level login. You can see all the classes that it goes through, all the filters, the providers, and usually you will see, um, the the path that request has taken and where you expected it, right? So I don't know. I tried to log in with username and password, and I don't see anything that says username and password. So
Right.
probably it's not getting into that path.
Right.
Why and so on.
That's a great tip. And, you can't just guess at this stuff. You really need some help to like point me in the right direction. It may not exactly tell you what's wrong, but at least it'll give you a direction. And okay, we're not getting there. Let's go ahead and look at maybe I didn't define the user correct, or that kind of thing. So,
And it's worth taking the time. So again, the reference documentation of Spring Security has great architecture pages
hmm,
that tell you how this is set up. And uh, a symptom I've seen often is people get, the getting started guide, and then they want to go further, and they don't really know what to do next. And then they go to
right.
Stack Overflow, they start copy pasting stuff, but it just doesn't work,
Right.
right? Like it has weird effects that you don't understand. And I think now when you want to go past the getting started guide, it's worth investing the time, taking an hour, reading those 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 reference pages, and
Hmm.
then looking through the samples and like clicking on the code and see where it goes to build a model of what it actually does.
Yep.
I got someone tweet at me after this presentation that it was good because it helped them um, figure out, where to start. And once you get the hang of it, there are three important concepts, maybe four for identity, and then five for authorization. Once you get those five concepts in, you can
Hmm.
understand the whole picture of it. And then that person said, once you get those concepts, it's actually super easy.
Yep. Cool. Got a question here. Do you need to implement CSRF if you are using a stateless management like JWT?
So with modern browsers, I think the answer is mostly no. You have the same site cookie protection, so you should lean on that, which helps you,
Hmm.
uh, and cross origin policies that you want to set if you're
Yep.
hitting multiple domains in the background.
Hmm.
Um, but I will use the caveat that's on the page, right? Assess your threat model, like
Right.
what could be done, and then you can think, oh, should I do this or not?
Yep.
Usually the answer for this would be most likely not.
Cool. How fast can one bring third-party LDAP with current Spring Boot security? Would you be able to do it now? So we cannot do it now, but
No. So I think it's IDP, identity provider.
oh, I'm sorry. Oh, I thought
Uh,
he was talking
uh,
about LDAP.
yes, it's very easy. So if you go into that video, because I'm sorry, I'm making a lot of shameless self
No,
plugs,
no, that's what we're here for.
but that video starts with the demo, and it starts with what we've done so far, and then the next step is to bringing Google accounts, so log in
Yep.
with Google, and it's a few lines, I think 2-3 lines
Yep.
plus the starter you want to include. So it's built for that. Like Spring
Yep.
Security is built. It's not built for you to manage your users. There are still cases where you want to do this, but I think in a modern world you want SSO, and it's built for this kind of authorized with the outside world.
Yeah, so easy to use. Couple lines of config, and then obviously, if you're using something like Google, you need to sign up for the service and get the secret key and token. You put those in your configuration, and that's all there is to it. It's really easy to use, really out of the box, easy to use. So great stuff. Um, Also, if one is using stateless management, is it best to save tokens in local storage? If not, how and what do you recommend?
So what I understand from the question here is like no sessions, right?
Right.
And so
This is
in the
rough.
front end, yeah, in the front end, do you save the tokens in local storage so that when you restart your browser, your token is still here?
Right.
I I am not a front end expert, so I wouldn't
I
give.
I mean, I'm not a front end expert either, but that is what I've done in the past. Yeah.
Right.
So I just stick them in local storage. Again, there's nothing secret in that token itself that you're storing in local storage is just going to have, the JWT information in it. You can easily decode that and see what you need to see. It's once it gets passed to the server, it's then verified that it's still a valid JWT token. So yeah, I see no problem with just storing that in local storage if you want.
It's the key to your house, basically.
Right. Yep.
Usually the recommended patterns now is when you're using a full OAuth framework, is your front end has a backend with it, right?
Hmm.
And so the backend will be doing the storage management. You only store the session in the front end, and so you don't have to think about this. Local storage is fine, and the cool property of those tokens is that they can be revoked. You can say, "Oh, not that
Yes.
one."
Yep.
Like
Yep.
that user emailed me that they got their laptop stolen. I can revoke the credential that was issued to
Right.
them without them having to reset their passwords.
Cool. All right. What does gateway security mean, and when do I use that over filter security?
So I think when we refer to gateway security, we refer to Spring Cloud Gateway,
Right.
right? Which is built for building these gateway type applications. So,
Mhm.
distributing traffic here or there and like doing more advanced stuff
Yep.
on requests, right? Rate limiting. And as part of
SSO.
this, yeah, exactly. As part of this, you can do some level of security, right? So
Hmm.
you as a developer, as an app developer, you make an app, and then this app has no security by itself. It sits behind something that handles the security, and
Hmm.
this would be the gateway, potentially built with Spring Cloud Gateway.
Yep.
Um, and so, if your application is security agnostic, then you don't need filter security. You need the gateway in front that does this gateway
Yep.
security.
Cool. Keycloak for Spring Security. I think
Um,
that's
That's
more of a
that's that's a loaded question, right? So Keycloak is for those who don't know, it's an OAuth 2 authorization server and OpenID Connect provider, and you could rebuild Keycloak using the newly 1.0 Spring authorization server that's going to come out. Um, I think the first level of answering this question is you can use both, right? So you have all your user management or your upstream identity provider management in Keycloak, and then Spring Security you use in your apps to talk to Keycloak, and
yep.
then authenticate users, get permissions and stuff like that. Now, I have never had to manage Keycloak in production myself. I have heard it is quite it's a real piece of software. Like if you were to operate your own Postgres, it requires some skills. I think Keycloak is the same. Um, uh, Now you could build your own authorization server using Spring Authorization Server, unless you have specific needs. That's probably not what you want to be doing, right? So unless you have very specific needs around the tokens that are going to be issued, around how users log in, I think I would like my first instinct would be to delegate that to the team that does identity in my company, and
Hmm.
maybe they have a Keycloak, maybe they have Azure Active Directory, and I
Right.
would use that and then just be a client with Spring Security. Now, if I have specific requirements, then this is where you start um, thinking about Spring Authorization Server.
Yep.
Um, and as for myself, I've contributed to the authorization server, so I think it's a great piece of software. But it means you will be wiring things, and it will be doing OAuth for you, and will have opinions which might be different than the ones from Keycloak. So
Right.
trade-offs.
Cool. Thank you. All right, just a couple more questions and we will wrap this up. Are there any anti-patterns, mistakes people fall into when using Spring Security?
Yes, definitely. I think the biggest anti-pattern that you will see is when you go beyond a simple usage and you want to customize things, right? So, I chatted with someone in a conference, and they had separate services for associating which user had access to which product, kind of, and so the 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 idea is like I need now to go deeper into Spring Security to leverage that third-party service or that extra app, and so I'm going to start writing my own filters, and
Yep.
the answer pattern that everybody starts using is that at some point it will have to produce an authentication object, and they will be using a username password authentication object, even when it
Mhm.
has nothing to do with users or passwords.
Yep.
Um, and so using that, if you go into that territory, take a moment, go to the reference doc, look at the architecture, and understand what this authentication is, what the different types are, and how you can extend it to fit your specific needs. Spring Security is all about, just like Spring, right? It's all about composition, right? I take
Yep.
different pieces and I make something out of it. So rewriting or like reusing a thing and just hammer it to make it fit the right shape probably means you want smaller blocks that you assemble yourself.
Great answer. Um, Let me see here. How would one go about protecting the login form with authentication? Let's say reCAPTCHA.
Ooh, that's a good question. I don't think that's supported out of the box with
Right.
Spring Security, um, but basically, I guess reCAPTCHA gives you some sort of token once you've completed. I've never used it. Do you know how that works, Dan?
No, but I mean, you could. So again, this is probably something, you know, if you're splitting this up and you have like a REST API in the back end and you're doing your own kind of login form on the front end, this is something you're building into the front end. So you can use a reCAPTCHA plugin for whatever component framework you're using, use it there, and then just kind of authenticate that as it's getting passed to the back end. But
Right. Yeah, yeah, yeah. And
but yeah,
so
it's been a while
basically you
since
have
I've used it.
so my idea is like you do a reCAPTCHA, your front end gets either the Google will send a back channel thing, a notification to your service saying, oh, this request that is going to come in is okay. Or I think, I don't know how it works, but I imagine it gives you a token in the front end that you pass in
Right.
as part of the request.
I think
And then you would
so.
have a filter. So you would have your own filter for validating these reCAPTCHAs. You put them very early at the top and
Yep.
says, ooh, this is the login request, and I want this to have
Right.
reCAPTCHA. Or you can dig into how does that form login work. So when we've seen .form login with defaults that Dan showed earlier, if
Hmm.
you command click in IntelliJ or control click and see the definition, it uses a form login configure, and then
Right.
you will see what this provisions, and it provisions a abstract authentication filter or something.
Yep.
And then this
Yep.
one has a additional security checks method that you can override and put your reCAPTCHA in there.
Yep. Yeah, it's a good it's something I haven't done in a while, and that may be something that may be a great idea for a tutorial. Even the little like solve this math problem, right? Like what is 1 + 1? And you have to put in 2, and that gets kind of sent along with the request. So maybe I'll come up with something and put something on YouTube for that. So great question. Best practice to revoke or expire JWTs after a user is logged out or JWT has been compromised.
So, depends who issues the JWTs,
Yep.
right? If you're using Keycloak, I'm sure there's an API for that, or a web console that you can click and say, this one, I want it
Hmm.
revoked. Spring Authorization Server has a revocation endpoint as well. that you can enable, and then you can make calls to that one. If you're using Spring Authorization Server, then you can have your own custom mechanisms to revoke tokens as logout happens, right? So Spring Security has session management, and it has something when you log out. And so maybe you want to hook into that and say, oh, I logged out. Is there a token associated with this user? Yes, I have 3 tokens. I want to turn them, I want to invalidate them, revoke them. And this is how you would do it with Spring Auth Server.
Cool. All right. And one more question here. I think I already kind of see your head turning on this one, but I tried to create a filter for authorization, and I see a lot of examples that use filter that extend once per request filter, but there's also a generic filter being. What's the difference? And before you answer this, I know that you went into this in your workshop. So
yes, I mentioned
some
it.
examples of this.
So once per request filter extends generic filter bean. And the difference is that once per request filter wraps your code and makes sure it's only executed once per request. Because you could stack and have a filter that does, the same thing, but at multiple times during the request. So for example, before being authorized and after being authorized, right? And you could do the same code. Once per request filter makes sure, if it's happened before being authorized, I don't need to re-execute it after being authorized. Mm-hmm. Depending on what you're doing as well, if you're doing something that is producing an authentication, you want to lean on the new-ish. It's called authentication filter. So like Spring Security has this base class for building filters that handle authentication. Authentication filter is a good base class for that.
Cool. Yeah, and I will echo this. DevOps workshop was great, by the way. It was. If you haven't watched it, you need to go watch it. And I think that's where we're going to end things today. So make sure you check out this workshop. Really good introduction into Spring Security. Again, Spring Security Demystified. I really love how you went into like how to debug things and like how to see all the different filters in the request, and just a really practical getting started with Spring Security. So check that out. What's the next step after that workshop? So I know it was a 3-hour workshop. What do you do after that workshop? What's kind of the next steps?
After consuming it?
Yeah. So like I've learned all this stuff in this 3-hour workshop. What's next? Is that really getting into kind of like more complicated things like authorization? So let's talk about authorization server.
Yeah. So there is this workshop is mostly focused on authentication, knowing who the user is. There's a whole chapter that I didn't write about authorizing and saying what is allowed, what is not allowed. Right. Then from there, I contend it's easy to fit your use case into Spring Security using that. And then maybe the next step is contributing to Spring Security. It's a big project. It's used a lot. So feel free to come around, check the issues, ping us on Twitter, by email, wherever, and then come have fun with us. And if you really like, the details of a protocol, then RFCs are the way to go.
Awesome. This is my first time attending office hours. How often is this conducted? We do this every week, usually on Tuesdays, usually in the afternoon, but we did it this morning, so Daniel did not have to stick around very late. It's already getting late around in Paris, so we're going to let him go soon. Great content. There will be no show next week, again, because of Thanksgiving. Great. Thank you. Great session, and hello. Thank you, everyone, so much for showing up. Daniel, if we've watched this video, this workshop on getting started with Spring Security, where else can we find you? Where can we find out more about you or things that you're working on?
So you can find me on Twitter here at Curlan. At least it's unique. You can find me at garnier.wf. So you can see some contact information over there just by looking at my full name that you will see in that Spring Security talk. I'm pretty unique on the internet. And of course, you can come and see what we're doing at VMware Tanzu with the Tanzu application platform and all the SSO goodness that we're putting in there.
Cool, cool. Well, thanks again, my friend. I appreciate you taking some time out of your day to share all of your knowledge with us. Very much appreciated. And like you said, we'll have to do this again. There's so many things that we could talk about. So,
Well, if people want to hear some more, of course.
yes, for sure. All right. Thank you again, Daniel. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. And we will see you in the next one. Bye bye.
Bye-bye.